Electric cars are marketed as a low emissions way to get around. With their low running costs and long battery ranges making advancements, the electric vehicle is starting to see a boom in sales. In Q2 of 2022, sales of electrified vehicles saw an increase of 12.9% from a year ago's levels, and it is estimated that by 2025, 75% of plug-in vehicle sales will be provided by fully battery operated vehicles. But all may not be as clean and rosy as it seems. In this video, we're going to be going over the brief history of the electric car and looking at some evil parts of its past and present alongside its future. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the evil business of electric cars. Looking at the first EVs, if you are not a history buff, you may be led to believe that the first EVs are things like the Riva G-Wiz and the Tesla Model S, but actually electric cars are nothing new at all. The first electric car in the United States was developed in 1890 by William Morrison. The vehicle was a 6-passenger wagon capable of reaching up to 14 miles an hour, not too bad for its day. Before long, there were many variants of EV being worked on, and they were actually quite successful. And you may be wondering now, why did they not catch on? Well, actually, they did. They were very successful for quite some years. They were only superseded when fossil fuel vehicles started to make very rapid advancements, leaving electric vehicles looking like something of the past. They started to become bulky, heavy, and slow. They looked like technology from many years bygone. Before long, the public had moved on, and the Ford Model T was the best-selling car. And as far as the petrol automobile goes, the rest is history. Now, in many ways, the problems that were seen about 100 years ago with electric vehicles are still quite relatable. The weight, price, these are all things which petrol vehicles still do better to this day. For instance, it would be very hard to find a $5,000 EV which can run 400 miles on a tank and seat a family of 5, which brings us nicely into the modern day problems that we are facing. Whilst many people want to buy EVs, there are certainly some challenges which the industry is facing, leading people to simply continue to buy the typical petrol and diesel cars. One big thing which people are struggling with is the price. No matter how willing most people are to adapt to electric vehicles, they simply cannot afford to. For instance, the 2022 Kelley Blue Book data shows us that the average cost of an electric vehicle is $62,876, which is $15,000 more than the auto industry average, simply pricing most people out. On top of this, we can see that range of electric vehicles is severely compromised compared to their petrol and diesel counterparts. The average petrol and diesel car could easily go 500 plus miles on a refuel, whereas the average EV has a range of around 194 miles. Now, whilst this may not be a problem for the average person trying to get from work and back, it really starts to become a problem when we think about the adoption for business. Companies may travel up to thousands of miles per week, and it's just going to take too long to refuel electric vehicles. Tying us nicely to our next point, the refilling process. We know that the traditional cars take around 10 minutes or less to fill up, whereas an EV can take hours, and this is a real problem for most people. And some of the problems that we see with EVs right now can be ironed out, and some people will be saying that certain cars can do things better. Whilst that is true, a lot of expensive cars are not affordable to most people. And whilst these problems can be fixed, we need to look at the current technology that we are seeing right now. Whilst advances are being made and we hear about the good news, a lot of the bad and secretive news is simply being covered up and looked over. And that is where we are going to dig a lot deeper. Let's have a look at the evil story of electric cars in much more detail. We'll start off with the green lie. EVs are great for most people. Many electric vehicles are cheap to run, very fast to accelerate, very quiet, and simply make more sense for most people. But the fact that they are marketed as a climate-friendly solution is where the evil really starts. Let's have a look at what pollution really looks like. Now, we are all told that diesel vehicles are the worst for the environment due to their emissions on the road. But when you also look at the fact that fossil fuels is a finite resource, we can see where the problems with traditional vehicles start to arise. I do not think that either of these points can be disagreed with, but one thing which is deeply covered up and shrouded in secrecy appears to be the manufacturing process of electric vehicles. Well, let's have a look at what goes on whilst making an electric car. We're going to start off by looking at the battery. What happens when you're making an electric vehicle battery? Well, it starts off with elements such as cobalt, nickel, manganese, copper and iron, just to name a few. And this is where the problems start to arise. Let's first have a look at the ethical questions. It is well documented that cobalt mining often takes place in unethical conditions, with unsafe labour practices. We've seen a lot of this in countries like the Congo. On top of this, we know that producing lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles is much more material intensive than producing traditional combustion engines. And this is going to become very key as demand starts to skyrocket from now. And the level of hypocrisy in the industry is certainly covered up, because a lot of the precious metals extracted are done so using fossil fuels anyway, due to the use of excavators and other mining equipment. But if you think that this is bad, well, you haven't seen anything yet, as it's about to get a whole lot worse. Battery materials come with other costs too. Mining the raw materials like lithium, cobalt and nickel is very labour intensive, but it also requires chemicals and an enormous amount of water, frequently in areas where water is already scarce, and can leave contaminants and toxic waste behind. And this is of course happening all over the world, and this is very polluting. And to synthesize the materials needed for the production, heat is required. Around 800 to 1000 degrees Celsius is needed. Now this temperature can only be achieved cost effectively by burning fossil fuels, which again adds CO2. So in the process of the manufacturing of the batteries, a lot of fossil fuels are actually used. Now this is of course on top of the emissions produced whilst making the car's body itself. This is just for the battery that we have covered thus far. And remember, it gets even worse, because batteries wear out. Anyone with a 5-year-old iPhone will know this firsthand. The average lifespan of an EV's battery is about 100,000 miles, or 10 years, generally speaking, whichever one comes first. When the battery wears, a new one will be required, causing the process to start again. So we can see that this is going to happen over time. Batteries will still need to be replaced quite frequently. And then you have to ask the question of disposing of the batteries. So a lot of chemicals are involved, and that is very key. Now another key overlooked element, which nobody tends to want to talk about here, is the energy sources. Clearly electric cars run on electricity, but the question is, where is that electricity sourced from? Ultimately an electric car can only be as clean as the fuel it runs on. So where is that energy generated? And how does that compare to petrol and diesel cars? Well, let's have a look at how this electricity is generated. Electric cars rely on charging from the local electricity network. The power plants providing that are generally not emissions free. Even in California, 60% of electricity came from burning fossil fuels in 2015, while solar and wind together made up less than 14%. In some places these figures are inevitably going to be much worse, and this is still happening. And whilst progress is being made, it's not being made at a fast enough rate. So electric vehicles, whilst intensive to make on a chemical front, whilst intensive to make on a pollution front, they then go on to run on electricity, which is generally not from a clean source. And that is very key. So the question then is, what is actually dirtier? Is it the fossil fuel cars which run dirtier, or is it actually the electric car? Well, it's a very hard question to actually ask, because there are so many variable factors. Where is the electricity sourced from? Where is the mining taking place? In some countries it's better than others. But there's one thing that is very clear. Electric vehicles do not come without any cost whatsoever to the environment. They certainly do pollute, and their batteries will need replacing. So this video is not made to disregard electric vehicle technology, as it is advancing, and one day it may get to a point where it is actually very good. However, nobody really wants to speak about this topic when it comes to EVs. Everybody just wants to talk about how clean they are. And whilst everybody wants to live under this illusion, a lot of people are ignoring this point, and this is key because people purchase EVs for the correct reasons generally, but they don't realise what goes in to actually making them and the running of them. And that's very key. So when we're thinking about EVs, there are certainly some very deep ethical questions which we need to ask.